Hello, my name is John Horgan. I am a science writer and I also teach at Stevens Institute of Technology. And I like to interview colleagues who have written books. So this is part of a series that I started a while back. And with me today is a colleague who has written a book. His name is Michael Steinmann. He's a professor of philosophy here at Stevens. And he happens to be right across the hall from me. He's a neighbor, and we've been colleagues for like, I don't know, 15 years or so.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, long time. And so thanks for doing this, Michael. And I wonder if you could start by telling us why you know what, I'm going to start with an even harder question than why you wrote this book. I'm going to ask you why you became a philosopher in the first place.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, John. It's a great pleasure and great honor to do this with you, and I'm really grateful for this series of talks that you're hosting, and very happy to be your office neighbor. It's actually bad to be in sabbatical and not to see you around that often. The first question is usually very difficult for me to answer. There's a little bit of a cynical question, that is because I never wanted to do anything else. I never wanted to grow up and be in the real world and sit in an office. I always like to read and write and be on my own and be self-directed. And philosophy was just the way of doing it. I made some timid attempts to get out of academia, but they never really worked out. And eventually I thought that's the place where I most belong, where I feel most at home. So that's a very personal, maybe not so cynical answer to that. And if you want a more substantial answer, it's because I always like to deal with these unanswerable questions. And I think I like to make them actually more unanswerable and more floating. That's always been something that I've been really interested in. And philosophy is a way of getting things into a certain state where they seem more ambiguous than in ordinary life.
All right, so that was very revealing, actually. I love philosophy. I actually read quite a bit of philosophy. I like hanging out with philosophers, but I think a lot of philosophers have a wrong, and this is part of my arrogance, pardon me. I think a lot of philosophers have a wrong-headed idea of what they do. They actually think that they are going to give us truth. They're going to arrive at the truth. They're going to solve these big problems that humans have been wrestling with for forever. But you went into philosophy not thinking that you were going to solve problems and give us truth?
Well, yes and no. I mean, something that we can also say about the book is that I think there is something like a torn situation for us humans, if you want to be a little more dramatic on a Monday morning, in the sense that there is something like a truth, or there are certain criteria that we cannot really forego. Certain criteria as well of logical consistency, but also criteria that define moral commitments. I don't think that these are just non-existing. I don't think that these can be relativized in any kind of skeptical way. We have these moral criteria, and we can apply them to the world and say that certain things are bad. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to say anything. So I'm not a skeptic. But once you start asking yourself how these criteria actually are grasped, how they are applied, things become more questionable. And then you see that it takes a big commitment, a big intellectual commitment, sometimes also a big moral commitment to be attuned to these truths that actually exist. And in that sense, they become then more ambivalent, because they're not simply lying there. Then you can't just look them up on Wikipedia. You can't just Google them. You don't just get them out of a textbook like you would do with truths in chemistry or something of this kind, you need to to work towards understanding them, and that's where the more, again, ambivalent nature comes in.
Okay, so now I'm going to hold up your book. Here it is. Reframing Ethics Through Dialectics. And I just want to say that I just finished it this morning. I've been reading it over the past week. And it's really, I want to thank you for writing it. It's really a remarkable book. I found it profound. I found it really stimulating. It constantly made me stop and try to evaluate what I thought about an issue that you were wrestling with. There's a kind of narrative arc to it, where it sort of starts here and then it goes through a struggle and then there's a kind of resolution at the end. But we can talk about that, about the resolution that you do offer. Great book. But why did you write it? Why this particular book?
Yeah. Well, I guess there are two types of books we can say. There's one books that you plan out in your head and then you write them down. There we have a certain project in mind and then you elaborate on it. That's not a book like that. It's a book that grew in a sense almost by itself. Also took quite a long time to grow. And it eventually grew into the form that it is now through maybe the kind of struggle that you're describing and that I went through writing it. The core was actually the second part where I'm talking about contradictions in moral theories. That was something I started from. I've been writing about ethics for quite a while before I started the book. I've been teaching ethics even before I came to Stevens, applied ethics mostly, but also fundamental ethics. I was part of certain institutions that thought that ethics is very important for scientists and for students of all majors, and they should study and learn it. So I worked in these areas for quite some time, and actually at Stevens I was hired to teach mostly ethics, initially bioethics. So I was an ethicist and I was doing my job, hopefully not too badly, but there's something deeply frustrating about ethics, and over the years it became clear to me what it is. I often ended classes or semesters by feeling that I hadn't really achieved anything. Everything was in vain, and that the whole effort that went into presenting ethical theories actually didn't amount to anything. And the question came up: why is that the case? Why does it seem to be so frustrating to engage in ethical questions? Also, why is it so frustrating on a social level? I think we were constantly having ethical debates in the political realm, not just now, but even in the past. And they always led to a lot of dispute, strife, never to any kind of consensus. You can say that whenever ethics enters the scene, things end either again in equanimity or in frustration. So the question is, why is that so? And the idea then came to me that perhaps this has something to do with the fact that ethical positions and theories are dialectical, that they kind of exclude each other mutually or define each other in contrast to each other, so that whenever you adopt one, you actually don't adopt the other one, which then immediately raises a certain opportunity for conflict.
So I was going to ask you about the term dialectical. Dialectics is sort of the noun for the adjective dialectical. So I can just talk about a dialectics rather than a dialectical method or something. And so I actually did a little Googling to supplement what you said about dialectics. And let me ask you this: is the premise of a dialectical philosophy, let's say, or approach to thinking about issues, about moral problems, is the premise that there is never any final solution, that it's always point, counterpoint, and it's in this process, this kind of ongoing conversation, that you might get closer to something that you could call truth, but you never actually get there. There's always another counterpoint to wherever you arrive. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, it depends. I mean, dialectics is sometimes described in a very technical sense. You look it up, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's kind of a caricature almost, like always when things become too technical. In its most basic sense, yeah, it means that you think about certain issues, positions, theories, concepts in a way where you connect them, you think about them more holistically, you see how certain oppositions, contradictions emerge once you hold on to one concept, like you hold on to the concept of freedom, then you have to hold on to the concept of determinism, and then you are already in a sort of dialectical conflict. Now, there's different ways that you can spin this. You can say that this is going on forever. It's the experience that whenever we hold on to some sort of position or we think we have found it, we will see that it is still opposed to another one, and that would correspond more to your way of understanding it. You can also have the more Hegelian version, which is that all these contradictions eventually will be reconciled in something which he then calls the absolute spirit. So eventually there's no more contradictions to have, and all contradictions, once you have gone through them, they will be part of a whole, so to speak. That's another way in which you can conceive of it. I remain a little more agnostic towards this like idea of completion and absolute objectivity or absolute truth that we can reach. I'm more holding on to the kind of procedural, methodical idea of dialectics, where I would think that our best assumption is that whenever we hold on to one position, there's another one popping up, and the contradictions will never be finished.
For the purposes of this book, it seems like you are talking about dialectics as something that does not really have a resolution. Let me put more of a point on that. My takeaway from this book is that you don't think a consistent moral system that can help us resolve all our moral dilemmas is possible. Is that what you say?
Yeah, no, I don't think that that's possible. Yeah.
All right. And yet you hang on to the idea that the good, if you use the term the good to define the goal of morality, is a real thing. It's not something that we can dismiss just because we can't define it in a way that everybody can agree upon or that doesn't lead to contradictions. There it is, the good, right? So you're sort of, which is a little bit of a contradiction.
Well, maybe you can describe it from that angle. So if morality were just that, endless series of controversies, endless series of contradictions, people coming up with some sort of position and others accusing them of being hypocritical or strategic or whatnot, then eventually we could just give up on it. We could just say, this is just, I don't know, it's just talk. It's not very different from rhetoric. It's something that people use, for example, to put others down. So I want to show that I'm a better person than you. That's why I'm using more categories. But the whole purpose of it is to show that I'm a better person than you, and so on and so forth, or vice versa, of course. So there's always been a criticism of morality where the whole purpose of morality just simply dissolves, and again, it's not seen as something genuine. I think that I'm more of a moralist. I think that our moral ideas and commitments really mean something. That if we honestly try to express some moral ideas and maybe reach some some form of the good in the world that we live in. I want to take that seriously. So there has to be some substance to it. And eventually, what became clear to me as I was writing this book is that that substance is perhaps best expressed as with the idea of the good, which is a very traditional idea that's been around in Western philosophy since the beginning. And that in whichever way we approach that idea of the good, we always at least grasp some aspect of it in our moral ideas. So you're right, there's a sort of contradiction in it. And perhaps you can say, yeah.
A paradox, maybe, rather than contradiction.
Maybe a paradox, yeah. But again, if there were nothing to morality, then you wouldn't need to be moral in the first place. But if you could just simply be moral in the first place, so that everything would be fine, then we also wouldn't have to be bothered by it, because then everyone would already be moral in their own way. And that cannot be it, because we see that people are not moral in a way that we can criticize them, that they often abuse moral arguments. We often have to reject certain moral claims. So we take them seriously, but at the same time, we have to criticize them, which means we're always in kind of a split and important situation when we want to be moral agents. And that kind of paradox, I think, is what I want to articulate here.
Yeah. I love that, because I love the idea of a philosophy that is built on a paradox or a contradiction, because I think some of, a common definition of art is the lie that tells the truth. There's a branch of theology called negative theology, which starts from the premise that God is that which can never be described, and then goes on to try to describe God. An obvious contradiction, but then ends up in interesting places.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah, well, I'm not suggesting any theological argument, but yeah, in a sense, it's very much analogical to that. So Pascal, for example, I recently came across this, describes in very similar terms. So we're just kind of smart enough, fortunate enough to understand God, these things, but then we're in such a desperate and miserable situation that we constantly lose the ability of connecting with him. So we're both. We know what's good out there, but we're completely unable to grasp it and realize in our own ways, at least not, yeah.
All right, so you mentioned freedom before, and you do have a brief section on free will, but I wonder if we could just talk about that a little more. I think it's fair to say obsessed with free will. There's a strain of determinism in science these days that rules out or takes an extremely skeptical attitude toward free will, and that really bothers me. It seems to me, if we're talking about morality, you have to assume that free will is real. So free will means that we have choices. We can sort of imagine our future going in different ways, and we choose one thing over another in the case of morality because we think it's good, it's beneficial for other people, let's say, if you want to define morality that way. So what about free will? I wasn't clear on what your stand is on free will.
Well, that's because I tried very hard not to get into this topic because it's too complicated. In the book, well, there always have been two approaches. So one would be from within ethics, we can say, and all you need for that is to think that we're acting. The very idea of an action implies some sort of freedom, and you can define it in a very minimal sense. Actually, this goes back to Aristotle. It's when we're unconstrained. So if someone forces you to sit on the chair, then you're not free. But if you can get up from the chair, then you are free. So there's a practical way in which freedom can be understood. And you can make this a little more substantive. You can say it has to do with how we have conceptual truths, which we can then look to apply to the world in different ways, which then comes down to reflection and decision making. Again, also things you find even in Aristotle already. So we can ask ourselves, what would be a good meal for me today? And then you already are engaged in a process where you have some sort of freedom to decide. Then, of course, you have the more difficult question, which is the question from the perspective of nature and deterministic systems. Question is, do you need to resolve that question? Does it really help you, for example, to decide what you will have for lunch today? Does it even mean anything? So if you want me to make a bigger statement, and I might as well make it. So I have increasingly the suspicion that determinism is actually an untenable position. So we always think that determinism has to be right because it's scientific, and freedom is just a problematic partner in this equation. But if you look at it again, practically freedom is actually kind of obvious. It's what we do. It's equivalent to action. And determinism is much more problematic because you can actually only have deterministic statements in a closed system, for example, or if you assume that there's a closed system of physical factors. I think that deterministic arguments have been hypothetical always. It's kind of God's point of view, which we don't have, or any other similar point of view, where it's the assumption that if we have a causal system in one place, it has to be a causal system everywhere. Well, I'm not sure that these assumptions from, let's say, the jump from a closed system to a global system is valid, and that determinism actually holds on all levels of nature.
Okay, I'm going to take that as an affirmation of free will. So thank you. All right, so I want to ask you what may be a related question. This is something that you and I have talked about offline, so I don't know if this is fair, but where do our moral intuitions come from in the first place? How is it that we are creatures that even have these concepts of the good and the bad, and especially the good being something that isn't just satisfying our hunger or sexual desire, things like that, but embodies what we think is good for people around us, and maybe even for all of humanity. Where does that come from, if not from evolution and biology ultimately?
Yeah. So I think you're leading me to the mind-body problem. Well, let's take the term biology, and this is also something I'm increasingly interested in. So the question is, for example, what we mean with biology. So again, evolution means, okay, there's some organic beings running around. Some are more successful, then they survive. Others are less successful, and then they die. So that's the theory. Biology could also mean there's our body with the cells, maybe with the skeleton, how we eat, what we eat, and how we procreate, and these kind of things. But for example, we also have developed a mind. We also have developed a psyche. That seems to be part of biology as well. So why should we not, for example, say that what we now call psychology, and what we always put in a different department than biology, is part of biology as well. So our biology has given us a rather complex psyche with all kinds of things going on in it. For example, sometimes the awareness that with all this amazing ability to think, we're never thinking in the right way. We all actually sometimes have the impression we're thinking too much. And so right here, you're not really sure what's the best description you want to give about a human being. So if you take psychology into biology, then you can say that conceptual thinking, in the sense that we use higher terms instead of just pointing at stuff, we use some sort of general term that applies to various objects, like we generalized to apples, we generalized then on higher levels to freedom, eventually we generalized with terms like good and bad. why not say that that's just simply something that's grown out of evolution as well, up to a point where you can't really trace everything that we do back to evolution. And again, you can't. I mean, why are you watching sports? Because of evolution. I don't know. Why are you eating sushi maybe for lunch? Because of evolution. At some point, evolutionary explanations and so, they don't really mean anything besides a very narrowly defined biological set of criteria in which that theory then applies.
Yeah. Okay. I'll accept that. I'll accept that from now. I don't know if that will satisfy my friends who are coming from the field of evolutionary psychology, but I see your point. All right. I wanted to talk about where you end up in your book, because there are some, I mean, you foreshadowed where you were going to a certain extent, but I was still surprised by some of the directions that you went. So I wonder if you could talk about forgiveness as a kind of resolution that isn't really a resolution of some of these moral dilemmas that particular moral systems end up in.
Yeah, so well, as you say, so we have a lot of analysis of contradictions, problems. I wouldn't call them dilemmas, because I don't think that dilemmas really exist. Paradoxes, oppositions, controversies, that kind of thing. So morality can well appear to you as something that doesn't amount to much, and it can even appear to you as something that's more harmful than not. But if you want to apply moral criteria in a very rigorous way, you have to condemn a lot of people around you. Sometimes we feel inclined to do that, and maybe these people would deserve to be condemned, and maybe we would deserve to be condemned. But at the same time, it means that morality then becomes a tool to create a lot of strife and even negativity in society. And I think we can see that tendency of morality, that if you take it seriously, it becomes too rigorous, as a reason for a desire for forgiveness, which would at the same time be a desire for letting go of moral criteria and coming to just simply an accepting a position. So let's not condemn each other anymore. Let's end these endless moral debates that never come to any kind of fruition. Let's just forgive each other and move on, for example. That could be an impetus that grows out of morality, kind of a moral impetus to get rid of morality. So another paradoxical move, of course, but I think one that's motivated by the inherent tensions that morality creates.
Yeah, you quote, I guess one of the things that surprised me is that you suddenly quote from the New Testament. You quote from Jesus as an authority on forgiveness, and some of the quotations were very moving. But you were also suggesting that ultimately, all this forgiveness that Jesus is asking for, a kind of universal forgiveness, suggests a world that is just too unlike our world. And that seems a little bit too much like heaven or utopia. Is that fair to say?
Well, certainly if you give more of a religious spin to it, if you give more of a worldly spin to it, you can say it's just simply too forgiving. It's too loving. It could amount to not taking morality seriously enough. Taking the distinctions and the distinctions between good and bad seriously enough. I mean, let's just, for example, if you take this into the modern context, let's just abolish prisons, for example. Let's just get everyone out. And by the way, I'm going to choose also because Nietzsche is actually in that sense very close to Jesus, Friedrich Nietzsche, in his positions, that he two things that at some point the desire will come to be redeemed from morality and moral condemnations and moral oppositions altogether, and just simply accept everything as it is. So I read what we find in the New Testament, not in a religious way. I see it as just an extreme way to practice forgiveness with all the social problems that come with it. Not punishing anyone anymore, accepting all criminals and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I actually was thinking about the indictment of Donald Trump and whether we should all just forgive him for all his sins. I'm sure he would be thrilled. Or maybe not. I think he likes being a martyr. Then you went from Jesus to Nietzsche, which I thought was really interesting. And you're alluding to beyond good and evil, to a world that is transcended morality. Is this kind of thing at all useful for living our lives? Is it this kind of spiritual transcendent principle that it's okay to have that up there somewhere, but it's not really of any practical purpose?
Well, I don't think it's transcendent. It can be immanent as well. I mean, sometimes, for example, we need to forgive each other for practical reasons. In politics, actually, we do that all the time because we need to continue to work together. That's actually Arwen's point, that human practice constantly kind of gets entangled in certain problems. And then someone has to come and say, look, let's make a new beginning. Maybe even elections, we can say, in democracy is a way to kind of institutionalize forgiveness. So someone is there for 4 years, totally messes up, because when you do something, you mess up, and then let's forget about this, let's continue anew. So we do this practically, I think, much more often. In the more radical way, well, what do you do when you meditate, for example? You want to, first of all, they tell you to forgive yourself, to accept yourself. So with all the nonsense that's going on in your life and the things that you're doing wrong, you still have to accept them. And then maybe while you do that, you forgive everyone else around you too. So I think it is, in a sense, something very practical, but because it negates all the distinctions that we usually make, it has kind of a almost nihilistic aspect to it, because it means all these moral criteria doesn't really matter, or let's just find peace. So I wouldn't call it transcendent. I would maybe transcending, in the sense that you transcend certain boundaries that you usually set. I think that we need it sometimes, but again, I agree with you. It creates questions about whether that's even a practical position that we should adopt. Yeah.
So I have a philosophical acquaintance, Owen Flanagan. You might have heard of. He was at Duke for a long time. I think he's emeritus now, and he wrote a book on morality called, I think, something like The Geography of Morals, and it was like a cross-cultural study of all different moral systems. It was similar to yours, even though it was kind of anthropological and looking at a lot of real cases, whereas yours is a bit more abstract. But he's looking for sort of common ground, and it's difficult for him to come up with some set of common principles. What he does come up with at the end of his book is doubt yourself. Doubt yourself as a kind of philosophical idea and as a moral principle. And I'm just wondering what you think of that. Doubt yourself.
Well, the question is always, what do you mean with these formulas? Because formulas, they condense something, and then the question is, what do they condense? If it means that doubt your own goodness, doubt the way in which you think that you have achieved certain moral ideas, doubt yourself in being moral enough or good enough in this world, then yes, certainly, yeah. If it just means doubt everything because there's someone else in some other corner of the world who holds different views, I don't think that that gets us very far. That would get us into relativism. But I'm not familiar enough with that position to see where he's actually getting at with it.
The way I take it is, I think it's kind of a principle of liberalism, where the goal is for people to get along, and it means don't take your own beliefs too seriously, question them at least to the point where you can tolerate other people who have different beliefs than you. It seems like kind of a sound principle. The thing that bothers me is that there's this famous Keats line. I can't remember it exactly, but it's that the idea of it is that the good people doubt themselves and the assholes are filled with certainty. And so I think that's kind of a problem of the principle of doubt yourself.
Yeah. Because if you take morality serious, at some point you might not want to doubt anymore. So, for example, I find these young people who glue themselves to paintings or to walls in museums, or in Germany actually they glue themselves to the autobahn, and then everyone gets upset because the cars can't go through. I find it in a sense fascinating, because you can say that this is very annoying. It's a public disturbance. It's barbarian to destroy museums and things like that. At the same time, these people feel a real need and an urgency to make everyone else aware of climate change, and don't think that we could sit around doubting ourselves. So we need to do something. So I guess part of the endless paradoxical structure of morality is that even in order to doubt yourself, you need to be certain about some things. And at some point, maybe you want to say, I have to make a distinction here and say that certain things are bad and they cannot be continued. So yeah, that sense we are back at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I got a couple more questions for you. One is, does thinking about morality in a serious way, which you clearly have done, and which other people who identify as moral or ethical philosophers do, does it make you more moral or ethical? Let me just ask you about you yourself. All this hard thinking about morality, does it have any effect on your personal life?
Well, look, as long as I'm thinking about morality, I don't do anything wrong. No, I don't know. I think eventually each day can be a new challenge, and who knows what kind of bad thing we do. I don't think we're ever continuous. This has been Aristotle's dream, that if we continue acting in a virtuous way, at the end we will become virtuous, and then that virtuosity will perpetuate itself. And again, many philosophers have had that dream. I'm not sure that we can trust people to be as continuous as that. So yeah, so in that sense, I don't know, maybe tomorrow I'm not a moral person anymore.
I was going to, okay, here's like sort of an obnoxious question. Do you consider yourself a good person?
I try, but I have my flaws.
I will just say, I don't think anybody is the best judge of whether they're good or not. But I'm looking at you from the outside, and I can just tell you, you are a good person.
Well, thank you.
You're kind. You're considerate toward other people. And again, this is sort of a paradox. I think we all have a sense of who is a good person and who isn't. Some people fool us. There's the paradox of how do you define who is a good person and who is a bad person? And then it becomes really complicated. But we all have these intuitions. And I think your book demonstrates that. It's sort of bringing that paradox to the fore in a way that that I really appreciate it. I appreciate. So it's making me think much harder about what counts as the good. Okay, one final question. Are we getting better?
Well,
is humanity as a whole, let me define that a little bit more. Is humanity as a whole becoming more moral, meaning, I don't know, more considerate, more thoughtful toward each other?
Well, I tend to answer that with Kant, who raised that question in the Enlightenment context already. And I think you have to make a distinction. I think Kant is just spot on here that, of course, we can create better institutions, global institutions like the United Nations, which, for example, look at levels of poverty, and then we can allocate means to alleviate it. We've also created a certain amount of wealth that has brought people, for example, out of poverty. It also has given people, take Europe, given the incentive not to go to war with each other anymore, because there's just too much of the good life and too much luxury to be lost if you go to war. It's not imaginable anymore that France and Germany would send good cannons at each other. Have we therefore become better people individually, in the sense that we are less inclined to engage in aggressive, discriminatory behavior? I don't really think so, because again, that's something that presents itself from day to day. You wake up and there's a challenge and you have to respond to it. The war in Ukraine is certainly an example that we can still go into a war frenzy like we did before. If you, for example, take Europe and attitudes towards immigration, there's a certain peacefulness within Europe. There's a certain aggressiveness in maintaining its borders versus the outside. People get really stressed about immigration, and I think the reactions that triggers are not necessarily always good ones. So can we count on having become better morally so that we would not react in any violent way to whatever challenge presents itself? Climate migration, for example, if that gets worse in the next decades, I'm not so sure about it. So in that sense, I'm much more of a pessimist. I think that we can suffer something like moral collapse at a point where we're not sure anymore that we maintain the institutions that for the time being guarantee us to be good persons. So we become better in a sense, in a technical sense, but I think the chance of reversing that always exists.
You know, part of me wants to disagree with you. I like those charts showing that there's been improvement in areas like longevity and child mortality and human rights and all this sort of thing. But I think I agree with you in the sense that, and you know, I'm thinking of a former colleague of ours, Gary Dobbins, and his attitude toward moral progress. I sort of feel as though we should never be smug about moral progress. We should never be smug about what's right and wrong. I think this is what is meant by doubt yourself, that figuring out what's right and wrong should always be a struggle. There should never be some kind of algorithm that decides these issues for us. If we do all agree on some common algorithm, I'd say something has gone very wrong. You know, like turning over all our moral decisions to an artificial intelligence, for example.
Yeah. I mean, there's layers to that. One is also that our actions are increasingly interconnected. So let's say someone looks back at 50 years in the future, see how we all contributed to pollution in the way that we were living our comfortable lives. Have we then not all been pretty evil in the way that we were, just simply consuming energy without actually knowing it and without being intentionally evil? So if you take indirect actions, like even remote actions, wars in foreign countries, in faraway countries, if you take all that into account, then again, the question becomes much more complicated. Maybe individually, we are good people locally. What about, again, globally? What about from an outlook into the future? So, yeah. So there's hindsight, obviously, too. So you realize in retrospect how much you've been involved in something that you shouldn't have been. So in that sense, I fully agree with you. We should never be smug. We should never just applaud ourselves. Yeah, we have to continue questioning ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good note of uncertainty to end on.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to hold up your book again. Here's the book. It's available on Amazon, and I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah.
And it's really a very deep, stimulating read, and I urge everybody out there to check it out. Okay.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for this conversation, and thanks for the good words about the book.
Sure. And hope to see you next door sometime soon.
Yeah, I hope so too.